Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take your source materials, stack them up, and find the nuggets of knowledge and insight you need to be truly well-informed.
And today we have a really fascinating set of materials you've sent us. It's a deep analysis of the leadership paradigm of Hazrat Abu Bakr as Siddiq.
It is. Now, before we really get into the substance, we do need to address the very specific framing that came with the excerpts you shared.
Right. The context is important here.
It is. The discussion you provided, which centers on Mr. Zahir Ahmad Mir's book, Hazrat Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, it began with a clear introduction. It said, Assalamu alaikum, welcome back to our channel, II Islamic Abrahamic Wisdom. And it also included this explicit instruction to, quote, please subscribe our channel, and like please, and also share this video to your friends.
And we're mentioning that because it really defines the perspective and the intent of the original material.
Exactly. Our mission here, though, is a bit different. We're going to step back and conduct an objective, a really thorough analysis of the core principles themselves.
The principles of servant leadership and moral consistency that are exemplified by Abu Bakr as they're detailed in these discussions.
Right. So we've titled this exploration, Humility, Servant Leadership, and Personal Accountability, the Inner Character of Abu Bakr. We're really looking for the inner architecture of his character, what made his governance tick.
Yeah, what made it work and what made it last.
Okay, let's unpack this. Specifically, the foundational qualities that made his leadership model endure. We are starting with an incredibly high bar for ethical governance here.
A very high bar. And the sources suggest that the principles at play, humility, consistency, and this deep personal accountability are just profoundly relevant even today.
So where do we start? What's the big idea here?
What's truly fascinating, and this is really the central concept of the source material, is how Abu Bakr viewed authority.
Okay.
It's argued he didn't see it as an elevation, not as a promotion or a prize. He saw it as an intensified burden of service.
A burden of service. That's a very different way of looking at power.
It fundamentally flips the conventional script. I mean, in almost every other historical and modern context we see, power is treated as the ultimate reward. It's the goal.
Right. It's what you work for.
Exactly. But here, the sources present the highest office as a magnification of personal responsibility and accountability. Leadership wasn't about gaining status. It was about accepting a heavier moral load. Almost, you could say, a spiritual debt to the community and to a higher power.
That distinction authority as a spiritual load rather than a personal reward, that seems to be everything.
It is.
Because if you don't view the office as a prize, you're so much less likely to cling to it or to, distort yourself to fit its demands.
You're not protecting an asset, you're fulfilling a duty.
And that immediately sets the stage for Section 1, the foundation of authority. This is where we look at how his foundational character traits really defined his rule. Let's start with point 1. Leadership rooted in humility. The sources define it entirely as service, not superiority.
And the sources make a really compelling case here by detailing specific behavioral markers, things you can actually see and point to.
Right.
Because we need to define this humility not just as, a gentle demeanor or being quiet. It's a deliberate, active rejection of the privileges of power.
So it's an action, not just a personality trait.
Precisely. And when we analyze his tenure, we see 3 critical elements that show how deep this humility went and how it defined his whole approach to the caliphate.
So tell us more about those specific markers. What was the evidence that this wasn't just, a performance for the public?
Well, the first marker is maybe the most difficult test for any leader. It's that authority did not elevate his ego. The moment power is conferred on someone, the temptation to feel superior or uniquely entitled or even infallible, it's immense.
You see it all the time.
All the time. But the sources suggest he was basically immune to that temptation. And the reason was that his internal estimation of himself remained fixed on his duty, not on his title.
So it required a constant state of vigilance.
Yes. An active denial of the ego's desire for grandeur. We're talking about a kind of spiritual discipline that ensured the weight of office settled on his shoulders, not on his head.
And the second marker you mentioned, it must flow right out of that.
It does. It's that his position did not alter his behavior. He didn't suddenly adopt the mannerisms, the official distance, or that stifling formality that usually comes with holding the keys to the state.
Right, the whole performance of being the leader.
Exactly. We often see leaders performing a role. They adopt a persona that power demands. The sources suggest he just was the man, regardless of the staggering title he held. It means that the character of the caliph was absolutely identical to the character of Abu Bakr the merchant.
No separation between the public and private self.
None, and that ties directly into the third point. Power did not create distance. He remained physically and emotionally approachable, gentle, and grounded.
He literally continued living among the people.
Yes, instead of moving into some ceremonial palace. This deliberate refusal to create barriers, the layers of aides and guards and rituals that insulate a powerful person, that is maybe the clearest expression of servant leadership.
Because it ensures the leader is never cut off. They always hear the unfiltered voice of the people they are governing.
Always.
I think the paradox that the source highlights here is maybe the most insightful part of this. It says this humility was defined not as weakness or timidity or a lack of ambition. It was, in fact, inner strength.
That's the core of it. It took tremendous inner strength to resist the intoxicating draw of self-importance that absolute power offers. Humility was the discipline that allowed him to see the task clearly, the service required, rather than seeing his own reflection and, his own self-aggrandizement in the office.
So it's the difference between strength from external validation titles, respect, fear,
Right, all the external stuff.
and strength that comes from internal clarity, from a commitment to principle and a moral purpose.
Precisely. A leader whose ego is untouched by power is fundamentally unshakable. Their sense of self-worth isn't tied to the ups and downs of political success or failure.
Which means they can absorb the power without letting it corrupt the self.
And that is the definition of inner strength the sources are pointing to. It means he could withstand both excessive praise and, just as importantly, harsh criticism without losing his footing.
That kind of resilience is just incredibly rare. The sources state this, but were there specific tests or moments mentioned where he had to actively fight against that ego temptation? How did he manage those internal conflicts?
Well, the sources focus more on the consistent outcome, but the very act of him continuing his daily routine as a merchant after becoming caliph is described as a daily internal test.
Because the pressure to change must have been immense.
Immense. The most senior position in the entire state demanded a full-time, state-level performance, yet his impulse was to remain self-sufficient and accessible to everyone.
So what happened?
Well, when the community insisted he stop his trading to devote himself fully to governance, he accepted a stipend. But it wasn't a salary appropriate to his power. It was just what was necessary to sustain his family.
So he kept his personal finances completely separate from the state treasury.
Exactly. This rejection of the expected economic and social elevation is the practical day-to-day manifestation of resisting the ego.
And this leads us directly to point 2, which is the continuity of personal life after authority. It's the practical proof of the humility we were just discussing.
It is. The sources really emphasize this active rejection of grandeur. After becoming caliph, he insisted on maintaining his ordinary routines. He continued to live in his simple home.
I've read accounts of him performing manual labor.
Yes, things like milking goats for neighbors who were too old or frail to do it themselves. He literally lived among the people, performing these small acts of communal service that really transcended his political role.
He was actively avoiding that ceremonial distance.
He was rejecting artificial grandeur because, at its core, grandeur only serves the ego of the ruler. It does nothing for the needs of the ruled.
And when you think about the infrastructure that's required to maintain grandeur, the security, the separation, the court rituals, it consumes resources and it demands a constant performance from the leader.
And he essentially stripped all of that away. He deliberately created an environment where his genuine self was just constantly exposed, no filters.
So the profound insight here, then, is that leadership didn't transform his lifestyle.
No, it merely revealed his character.
And the implication of that for modern leaders is, well, it's profound.
It is, because today public figures often cultivate deliberate distance. They use formality, media training, careful staging all to manage perception and hide vulnerabilities.
They create a mask, a public persona.
Abu Bakr's model suggests that the truly effective leader is the one whose private character can withstand the scrutiny of public office without needing a complete overhaul or a mask. The office wasn't a transformative crucible for him. It was just a larger stage for the character that was already there.
And that transparency is the absolute cornerstone of public trust.
It has to be.
So that consistency builds this undeniable level of trust. But the deeper question is, what was driving this entire internal system? What was the engine that powered this rejection of ego and this embrace of service?
Right, and point 3 identifies that source. Accountability before Allah above all.
This is the governing principle, then, the moral compass.
It's the constant moral compass that oriented every single political and administrative decision he made. His deepest concern wasn't public opinion or political popularity, though he was deeply engaged with the public.
His concern was his answerability to Allah.
Exactly. And the source material breaks down the governing criteria, showing how this spiritual commitment translated into a rigorous internal auditing system that he applied directly to governance.
So this means every decision was weighed spiritually.
Yes.
Every command examined morally, every action measured against accountability. It wasn't just a vague religious sentiment. It was a practical framework.
A framework that dictated everything from resource allocation and military strategy to judicial review. The constant awareness that influenced everything was this powerful internal pressure. I will be questioned.
I will be questioned.
If you frame every executive decision, every policy, every deployment of resources through that lens, through the lens of ultimate spiritual accountability, your priorities shift drastically.
Because short-term political gains, self-enrichment, compromises made out of expediency.
They become impossibly expensive in the long run. Accountability for him wasn't an external bureaucratic process that you could game. It was an internal, inescapable spiritual fact.
So if we connect this to the bigger picture,
This internal spiritual gyroscope was the true source of his moral authority. His authority wasn't just granted by the community's consensus. It was granted by his recognized, unshakable commitment to a higher, unwavering standard of justice and morality.
so the people trusted him not because he was powerful,
But because they knew his ultimate fear was failing that higher standard, a standard that applied equally to him and to the lowest citizen in the state.
that fear of spiritual failure, rather than fear of political failure, is what liberates a leader from the tyranny of opinion polls or external pressure.
Yes, it allows them to make tough, principled decisions that might be unpopular for a moment, but are morally and systemically sound in the long run.
And this leads directly to the next point, point 4, moral consistency across roles.
When a leader is governed by this single ultimate accountability, there's just no psychological or practical need for a dual personality.
There's no secret private ethic versus a public ethic that's just political posturing.
Exactly. The source highlights the essential absence of this dual personality. His private and public ethics were identical. He didn't have one set of standards for his personal life and a different, more flexible one for the caliphate.
This timeline of character you mentioned, that he remained the same before leadership, during authority, and even at the moment of his death, that seems crucial for long-term institutional stability. Why is that consistency so vital?
It eradicates cynicism. It just wipes it out. And it lays the groundwork for institutional legitimacy. Think about it. If the public sees a leader behaving differently once they get power,
They assume everything before was a lie.
precisely, they conclude the leader's previous morality was just a strategy, a tool to acquire power. And that leads to profound distrust and makes governance incredibly fragile.
But with Abu Bakr, the consistency established this profound trust.
Because people recognized that his principles were integral, not situational. He wasn't playing a role, he was living a code. And that level of moral integration makes the entire governance system inherently more stable, predictable, and legitimate in the eyes of the population.
It proves that the system is based on law and principle, not the whim of a powerful individual.
Yes. And that is a perfect transition point. We're moving from the foundational being of the leader, his inner character, into the active doing of governance.
So, Section 2, the practice of moral governance. We're focusing on discipline and emotional intelligence, the active qualities he used in his decision-making and his interactions.
Right.
Let's start with point 5, which is just so counterintuitive for most high-level executives today. Openness to correction and accountability.
It really is. Most leaders, when they reach the pinnacle of power, they tend to surround themselves with people who agree with them.
Civic offense, yeah.
And they shut down criticism because they see it as a direct threat to their authority and their competence.
But Abu Bakr actively invited accountability.
He did. The sources are specific about the practices that encouraged this. He welcomed advice. He accepted correction gracefully. And crucially, he did not suppress criticism, even when it came from his subordinates or just ordinary citizens.
I wonder, though, how an act of correction, which implies that you're fallible, didn't undermine his mandate. The sources say this ability to accept correction actually strengthened his leadership. How does that work?
It strengthens his position because it prioritizes truth and effectiveness over ego protection. It's a simple but powerful trade-off.
Okay.
By welcoming correction, he demonstrated two things that are absolutely essential for good governance. First, Humility, acknowledging he was fallible, which makes him relatable and trustworthy.
Right. The public doesn't expect perfection.
No, but they demand honesty and responsiveness.
Mhm.
And second, a commitment to truth. He prioritized the best possible decision and the correctness of the action over protecting his own personal pride or image.
So when a leader signals that the mission, justice, service, stability is more important than their own personal vanity,
People are much more willing to follow them, even through difficult, controversial decisions.
it makes me think of any high-performing team, whether it's in business or sports or the military. Accepting critical feedback doesn't undermine the coach or the CEO. It refines the strategy and improves performance.
It does.
But so many fragile, modern leadership styles mistake critical feedback for insubordination, and they create a culture of silence.
And that culture of silence is deadly. Here, correction is treated as a vital input, essential for refining the system and maintaining ethical vigilance. It creates a feedback loop of moral and practical continuous improvement.
And if the leader actively suppresses criticism,
The organization or the state becomes deaf, dumb, and blind to its own flaws, which leads to inevitable, catastrophic institutional failure. His openness ensured that the leadership remained dynamic and responsive, not brittle, defensive, and isolated by its own authority.
he essentially embedded a proactive ethical check into his day-to-day decision-making.
That's a great way to put it.
Okay, moving to point 6, compassion without weakness. This speaks to that constant tension between ruling with a firm, principled hand and ruling with a gentle, humane heart. Most people struggle with that.
They do. They swing toward harshness or kind of paralyzing softness. But the source material defines this balance as the core operational mode of his governance.
So even though he was gentle in his demeanor, he was never indecisive.
Never. And that's crucial. The gentleness was not a substitute for resolve or clarity of purpose. It was the manner of execution. The sources suggest he maintained an unwavering commitment to principle, but he applied it with understanding.
And we see that balance articulated in the legal and administrative dimensions. Mercy existed within law. Softness never compromised justice, and compassion never excused wrongdoing.
That is the high-wire act of principled governance. The rules have to be applied universally, regardless of an individual status. That's justice. But the delivery, the consideration, the sentencing, that has to be humane. That's compassion.
So if mercy steps outside the bounds of law,
It becomes arbitrary favoritism or sentimental weakness that undermines the entire legal framework. But conversely, when justice is applied without compassion, it becomes rigid cruelty. It drains the system of its moral legitimacy.
so the source description balance defined his leadership, means he successfully ensured that justice and mercy reinforced one another.
Instead of serving as competing forces, which is what usually happens.
This raises a really important question for leaders everywhere. How do you maintain that strong adherence to principles while also exercising grace? It requires exceptional emotional and intellectual dexterity.
It absolutely does. It means knowing precisely when to hold the line on a principle. For example, preventing public funds from being misused, and when to extend understanding, mitigating a punishment based on circumstances, or demonstrating clemency when it's appropriate.
And this balance prevented the state from becoming either tyrannical and unforgiving or chaotic and unprincipled.
He had to operate from a high vantage point, seeing the necessity of the rule while still recognizing the complexity of the human condition.
Which brings us directly to point 7, emotional intelligence in governance. I mean, his rule began during a period of just immense psychological and institutional turmoil for the community.
Yes, right after the passing of the prophet. This required more than just sound policy. It required a deep emotional understanding of that collective trauma.
Absolutely.
The sources describe his understanding of the people's emotional realities during that transition. He had to recognize the profound, debilitating fear that comes with instability. He had to acknowledge the intense communal grief after the loss of their primary guide. And he had to manage the administrative and political confusion in a time of unprecedented change.
If a leader fails to acknowledge the emotional reality of their people, the prevailing mood, the underlying anxieties, their policies, no matter how logical, will often fail.
Because they lack buy-in and trust. It seems like his first policy priority was psychological stability, and he used communication as his primary tool.
So what was his communication strategy?
It was clearly designed to stabilize the community on a psychological and spiritual level. The sources highlight 3 key elements. First, he reassured without deception.
That's a key phrase.
It is. Second, he guided without coercion, seeking conviction rather than just compliance. And third, he unified without manipulation, focusing on shared principles rather than exploiting divisions.
That phrase, reassured without deception, is so powerful because it's so difficult to do. It means facing the brutal realities of the situation honestly, acknowledging the difficulty, but framing those realities in a way that provides hope and direction.
Right. He wasn't minimizing the loss or hiding the instability, but he was articulating a clear, principled path through it,
And by guiding without coercion, he sought buy-in based on shared conviction.
which builds a resilient community that can internalize the values, not just a compliant one that follows orders out of fear. Emotional intelligence in this context wasn't just about being sensitive or empathetic. It was a foundational tool for geopolitical and social stability. It allowed him to harness the collective will toward recovery.
It was the crucial element that allowed them to navigate what could have been a fatal leadership crisis.
It was.
And underpinning all of these active practices, his openness to correction, his balanced compassion, his emotional intelligence, was the engine of self-discipline, which is point 8.
Yes, the
Right.
core idea that self-governance precedes and enables external governance. You simply cannot rule others if you cannot first rule yourself.
And if you look across history, the most successful figures who managed to maintain power without being corrupted by it almost universally mastered themselves first.
They did. The sources detailing Abu Bakr's character emphasized that the caliphate was not an arena for him to work out his own internal psychological struggles. Those had been resolved long before he ever assumed office.
So what were the specific forms of discipline mentioned in the sources?
The material details his specific practices: restraint in speech, discipline in conduct, and consistency in values.
Restraint in speech alone is such a powerful governing mechanism.
It is. In today's highly polarized, reactive environment, where a single social media post can cause international chaos, a leader who shows restraint in speech models calm and prevents unnecessary crises. He only spoke when necessary, and only with measured, clear intent.
And discipline in conduct prevents that erratic or impulsive decision-making that just destabilizes everything. A predictable leader creates a stable government.
Exactly. And that self-governance is what legitimizes the rule over others. The result, and the sources state this clearly, is that because he governed himself, others accepted his governance.
It makes sense. If a ruler is perceived as unable to control their own appetites for wealth, for flattery, for power, or their own temper, why would anyone trust them to manage an entire society?
His self-discipline provided the moral license for his authority. He was a model of the very values he demanded others uphold.
Okay, that concludes our look at the practical governance model. We've laid out the foundation and detailed the practice. Now let's explore the consequences of this character-driven leadership in Section 3, Legacy and Modern Relevance. We begin with point 9, humility as institutional protection.
And this is where the individual character scales up and becomes systemic. The sources argue that the leader's ethics flowed directly into the institutions he established and influenced.
We often think of institutional checks and balances as purely procedural things, written rules and structures.
But this source suggests that the leader's internal fundamental ethics act as the most robust check and balance of all. It protects the system from within.
So his personal humility had measurable systemic effects on the state. Let's look at the specific protections this humility offered.
Yes, 4 key protections really emerge from the analysis. First, his humility actively prevented authoritarianism. Because he didn't view himself as superior or infallible, he couldn't justify absolute, unaccountable rule
He was willing to be checked.
by the community and by law. Second, it strongly discouraged corruption. Because his own lifestyle rejected grandeur and materialism, he set a non-materialistic, service-oriented tone for the entire administration. Officials were expected to follow that same standard.
And what were the positive outcomes of that?
Well, third, it naturally invited trust from the populace, which is essential for mobilizing a society, especially during a crisis. When people see their leader living simply and serving selflessly, they are willing to make sacrifices themselves.
And finally, it strengthened legitimacy.
Immensely. The government was seen as serving principle, not the private interests of a ruling class. The institutions just reflected the ethics of their leader, and that's a critical insight for organizational design today.
How so?
If the ethical tone at the top of a company or a government is arrogant, self-serving, or focused on enrichment, that attitude just permeates downwards. It creates an environment where secrecy, abuse of power, and corruption thrive.
But Abu Bakr's humility created an atmosphere of transparency and service from the very start.
Exactly. It protected the nascent institutions from the pathologies that are so common to new power structures.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting and where we address the context from your source material head on. How does a 7th century model of character-based governance inform the 21st century data-driven world? This takes us to point 10, relevance for modern leadership and the explicitly mentioned AI-era ethics.
The sources suggest that the demands of the Abu Bakr model are timeless. And you could argue they're even more urgent in an era defined by immense technological power. Technology, data, and automation create these incredible power differentials.
And that power has to be matched by ethical restraint and self-governance.
And must be.
Let's break down the application. First, we need leaders who serve, not dominate, whether they're leading a country, a huge corporation, or managing a complex AI project.
Precisely. In the AI context, this means that those who build and wield this immense technical power, the power to classify, to predict, to automate governance, they must internalize that service mentality. The goal of the technology must be the betterment of the community, not the consolidation of the builder's technical authority.
Because when technical authority becomes dominance, it risks dehumanizing people.
It does. Which leads to the second point. We need accountability embedded in these decision systems. In the AI era, this directly translates into the demand for digital accountability structures.
You can't just trust the black box algorithm.
You can't. Just as Abu Bakr operated with that internal spiritual gyroscope, modern systems require verifiable, transparent accountability. This means mandatory, rigorous audit trails and a demand for explainability so that the logic behind an automated decision can be scrutinized by a human being.
If a human leader must be questioned, the algorithmic leader must also be questioned.
Without a doubt. And that spiritual accountability, when you apply it to data systems, demands humility and data-driven authority.
Which is so rare. The temptation for intellectual arrogance in the data space is massive.
It is. The tendency is to treat algorithmic outputs as infallible dogma because they come from complex math. But humility acknowledges that models are incomplete representations of reality. They're subject to training bias, data gaps, and they require constant ethical oversight.
So data-driven leaders have to resist the urge to claim perfect knowledge or predictive infallibility. They have to acknowledge the limits of the data.
Just as Abu Bakr acknowledged his human fallibility. And that brings back point 5, openness to correction.
Right. In the digital space, we need openness to correction in AI outputs.
Yes. If an AI system makes a decision that leads to an unjust outcome or propagates a known bias, the system has to be designed to accept, welcome, and rapidly integrate criticism and corrective action.
Instead of suppressing the evidence that undermines its perceived authority.
This system can't be brittle. If a citizen or an external auditor identifies a flaw in the algorithmic governance, the ethical structure informed by the humility of the leader must mandate a swift, transparent mechanism for correction. The opposite is the digital equivalent of authoritarianism.
And finally, we come full circle to the personal discipline that's required. Ethical restraint over technical power. Technology gives us an unprecedented capability to monitor, influence, and control populations.
And the model of Abu Bakr teaches us that just because you can do something, because the technical capability exists, it does not mean you should morally. This demands internal ethical restraint from the engineers, the executives, the policymakers.
Without that internal governance, the self-discipline from point 8 technical power becomes inherently dangerous.
It becomes susceptible to corruption and misuse. Power, whether it's political or technological, must be governed by character. That is the lesson.
That's the profound connection here. The strength of your entire system, whether it's a government or an organization, depends entirely on the consistency and integrity of the character at the helm.
Regardless of whether that helm is a 7th century administrative council or a 21st century server farm.
So what does this all mean for you, our listener? We've covered a massive amount of ground, looking at unwavering consistency, service-based authority, and the fundamental role of self-discipline in the character of Abu Bakr. True power, as it's defined by these sources, comes not from distance or superiority, but from an internal commitment to service and ethical consistency that transcends the title itself. It's an instruction manual for integrating a moral principle into hard governance.
And we have to end with the core principle drawn directly from our sources. It's the ultimate unifying truth that summarizes everything we've talked about regarding his moral authority. It is the defining ethical principle of his leadership.
What is it?
The strongest authority comes from a heart that fears accountability more than loss of power.
Wow.
Think about that principle in your own life and in the organizations you interact with, whether they're small teams or massive corporations. Which fear dominates the decision makers you encounter? Are they more concerned with surviving the next political cycle, the next quarterly report, or the next shareholder meeting? Or are they truly afraid of failing their deepest moral commitments and facing ultimate accountability? That fear, the fear of spiritual failure or moral accountability, that is the true, non-negotiable engine of moral leadership. So I'll leave you with a challenge. Consider which you fear more in your own life or organization. Being held accountable for integrity or losing your influence or position?
That's a challenging and a vital question to end on. Thank you for sharing your sources and diving deep with us today. We hope this exploration encourages all of you to explore the concepts of service leadership and moral consistency further, and to see how ancient wisdom applies so urgently to our contemporary data-driven world.